Have you been dealing with doubt, jealousy? Have you asked God, why me? Maybe why them? Have you lost your faith? Are you in a season of waiting? Well, then you're going to want to stick around for this video. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Woman on a Journey. If you are new here, my name is Emily, and on this channel I talk about all things motherhood, living a healthy lifestyle, homeschool, and faith. So if any of those things interest you, be sure to hit that subscribe button below and click that bell on the side. That'll give you notifications whenever I post new videos. So today's video is a collaboration with a few other women hosted by Ingrid over at the Ingrid Chronicles. And so what today's video and all the videos are about is we were challenged to take one woman from the Bible and basically share what we've learned from her story. And so that's what I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. Each person has a different woman that they've chosen. And so when you're done watching this video, be sure to check out Ingrid's channel as well as the playlist below with all the other women sharing their videos as well. So the person that I chose was Sarai, whose name was later changed to Sarah. Now, when talking about Sarah, it's hard to talk about her without talking about her hubby Abram, whose name eventually was changed to Abraham. And when looking at Sarah and her story, I can't help but look at myself and just different stages that I've been in my life and just how much I relate to this woman. So if you see me looking down, I just have some notes of some reminders of some things I want to mention while I share with you guys. So the first time that Sarai is mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 11, verses 29 to 30. And the way she's introduced is she's introduced as Abram's wife, who is barren. And so you see a couple of verses down that the couple follows their father, Terah. They're living in Ur of the Chaldeans, and they are traveling to Canaan. However, they never actually make it to Canaan. They stop in Haran, which is about a halfway point, and they settle there. Now, the Bible doesn't actually go into any detail as to why they never made it to Canaan, why they settled there, or why they even left in the first place. But what we do know is after their father dies, God speaks to Abraham and he calls him to leave his father's home, his family, that country altogether, and to move on to a land he would show him. And so God promises to make him a great nation and make his name great so that he would be a blessing. And this is in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And as a married couple, the promise that God gave to Abram at this time also was a promise to Sarai. Sarai had to trust God at that point in a very great way. One, she was barren and she couldn't have any children. So she had to trust God that whatever he said as far as making Abram a great nation, that was going to come true, and that she would actually have a child for that to be able to happen. The next thing is putting yourself in Sarah's shoes. I know if I put myself in Sarah's shoes, I would be nervous. I'd be worried. I'd be questioning if my husband heard correctly because they were wealthy and their father was wealthy, and so they had all that inheritance. And the fact that they were going to have to pick up and go and leave the rest of their family there, I mean, it would have, their friends, what they were comfortable with, talk about God stripping things from you to answer his call. And so just thinking about that, it questioned me to, how would I react? And, but she was obedient. She obeyed God. She trusted what the Lord had told her husband, and she submitted and followed her husband. And so that in itself already, just knowing that this was a test of Sarai's submission and her trust and faith in the Lord. And so at this time when they had to pick up and go, Abram was 75 and Sarai was 65. So as they traveled, they end up in Canaan, and the Lord appeared to Abram in the city called Shechem and said to him there, "To your offspring I will give this land." After some time, in Genesis 15, the Lord appeared to Abram in a vision this time, and he says to him, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Abram reminds God that he has no children. "You haven't given me any children." And now one of his servants, so he was worried that one of his servants will become his heir. And back in that time, if you didn't have children, then one of the highest servants in your household would be the heir of your family. So then God responds telling him that his own son will be his heir. Then he takes Abram outside to see the stars and tells him that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars. And he also told him that his offspring will inherit several areas of that land. That night, the Lord made his covenant with Abram. So I imagine like Abram must have gotten up, whether it was that same night or the next day, and he must have ran to his wife and just told Sarai all the amazing things that God had told him that night. And Sarai must have been overjoyed and excited, like, you know, this is really gonna happen. And at that time, it was a big deal for women to bear children. It was a blessing. And not to say it's not a blessing now, but the culture was very different. And a lot of what that culture was based on is women found their identity in being a mother and a caretaker of the home. And, you know, the fact that she didn't have that, it was almost like she wasn't blessed. Now, Sarai was beautiful. She was wealthy. She had a husband. She had everything. But her desire was to have a child. So I just imagine them getting up, getting excited. Maybe she starts making baby clothes. Maybe she starts thinking about all the things that she's going to need and prepare, and just excited for when this miraculous moment is going to happen. And so at this point, God had already spoken 3 times to Abram about making him a great nation, about blessing him. And now he specifically says that that his offspring is gonna be more numerous than the stars. And so Sarai must have been thinking, all right, it's been 3 times. God is just adding more and more to this revelation that he's giving, and the time must be getting closer. Now, as a reminder, Abram is the one who is receiving these divine revelations from God. And Sarai had to trust her husband's divine revelations and put her faith in God and his promise. Now, understandably, Sarai became impatient and frustrated after 10 years had passed and no child had came about. And Sarai was 75 years old at this point. And Sarai was convinced that she was getting too old, that God was going to keep her from having any children, and maybe he needed some help. Maybe that child wasn't coming from her. Now, to be honest, I'm a very impatient person, and I'm better, I think, than what I used to be years ago. But for me, and me being the type of person that is like that, I think 10 years is enough time of being patient. And so it was, I think, honestly, if it was me, after a year or 2, I probably would have been like, well, I don't know about this anymore. Like, maybe we misunderstood something. Maybe that's not really what God meant. Just seeing that she was patient that long shows that she truly put her faith and her trust in the Lord. But as time went by, her faith started to weaken. And so for you, that waiting season might be waiting for a child. It might be waiting for a job promotion, maybe a job altogether. Maybe you're unemployed. That also might be maybe waiting for a loved one to be saved, be healed. Maybe you're waiting for healing. And so whatever your situation might be, God's timing is perfect. So rather than trusting God's timing, nor consulting with the Lord, Sarai gave into her doubts. And so now when God promises something, it's good said and done. But one thing that comes to mind as we move forward and just kind of talk a little bit more about what she decided to do when she became impatient, one of the things that my pastor has said many times is, we want what we want, when we want it, how we want it, and when we want it. And so this kind of came to me while I was reading this. And so when Sarai gave into her doubt, she decided to talk to Abram and say, you know what? Why don't I give you my servant Hagar, and I can have a child through her. And so that's what she did. She gave Hagar as his wife. And now this was customary at the time, that if there was a wife that was barren, then they could have a maidservant become that husband's new wife, and he could have a child and produce through that person. And so now Abram knew directly firsthand the promise that God had made him. And God never said anything about how he needed his help to make it work. And so, but Abram went along with it. Hagar conceived, and then Hagar looked on Sarai with contempt. Sarai didn't expect that. And so she blamed Abram for Hagar acting this way. And so Abram didn't want to deal with it. He was like, you know what? Forget it. Like, she's in your hands now. So he relinquished any kind of power he had onto Sarai, and Sarai could deal with her however she felt like dealing with her. So with Sarai's anger, probably towards God, and anger towards Hagar for looking on her in contempt, she treated her harshly to the point that Hagar ran away. So Hagar eventually returns, and she gives birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. The consequences of Sarai's actions are still being lived out today. So this is a perfect example of how our decisions outside of God's will can cause consequences in our immediate family, in our immediate situations, and even in the future. So this decision that Sarai made, these consequences have lasted thousands of years. And this is why the descendants of Ishmael, who are the Arabs, and the descendants of Isaac, who are the Israelis, are still fighting against each other today. So fast forward 13 years, we move on to Genesis chapter 17. And at this point, Sarai had waited 24 years from the first time of hearing of this promised child. And still nothing. So Abram is now 99 years old, and the Lord appears to him again. And God says to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." His name is changed from Abram to Abraham, which means father of a multitude of nations. And a few verses down, God brings up Sarai, saying, "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Now, the name Sarai means my princess, and Sarah means princess. Now, there is biblical significance here. When God says the kings of people shall come from her, two of those many kings that came from that lineage were David and Jesus himself. So I also thought it was pretty interesting how God was giving Abraham bits and pieces every time he showed up. And he had spoken to him already 3 times before this 4th encounter. And each time that he spoke with Abraham, it was like he was giving him more pieces to this beautiful masterpiece of a plan. And so sometimes I feel like that's what God does with us, where he can't show us the whole plan because, one, he needs us to trust him and have faith in what he's doing in our lives, but also we might not be ready to see that whole grand plan. And so over time, he'll give us bits and pieces of what that might be. And one thing to mention is that Abraham does laugh at the thought of having a child at 100 years old and Sarah being 90. But God immediately tells him in verse 19 that Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. Now, not long after that, Abraham's sitting in his tent. These 3 men appear right outside his tent. They're standing there. And at this time, I don't think that Abraham realizes who they are, but then eventually figures out that they're angels from the Lord in human form. So Abraham offers to feed them, to have them wash their feet. And so he goes to Sarah. He tells her, we gotta make food for these people. And Sarah wasn't making sandwiches. That's not what Abraham's intentions were. She was making bread from scratch. She was making cakes. She was making a calf. They were gonna have just everything, just a wonderful, wonderful meal for these 3 men that just showed up out of nowhere that they were not prepared for. So now we're in Genesis 18 at this point, and one of the men asks for Sarah. However, after Abraham responds that she's in the tent, in chapter 18, verse 10, it says, "The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." So now the Bible makes it clear that Sarah was way past her childbearing years. So when Sarah was eavesdropping on the conversation, she hears this and she laughs to herself. And she's thinking, after I am worn out and my Lord, referring to Abraham, is old, shall I have pleasure? She's probably like, I've heard that before. So she had faith in this promised child that never showed up. And so for her hopes for that was gone. She probably wasn't even thinking about it anymore. But in verse 13, it continues with, "The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Now, Sarah hears this and she denies laughing because she was afraid. No one knew that she laughed. She didn't laugh where they could hear her. She laughed inside. And the things she said inside of her mind. But as we all know, God knows our heart, God knows our minds. And so God heard it all. And she says, "I did not laugh." And he said, "No, but you did laugh." Now, when this happened, I can imagine Sarah, that fear still being there and just being like, oh my goodness. And she probably ran and repented. And I believe that her doubt was washed away at that point. And so we could see that Sarah, known as the mother of nations, she was flawed, but she was faithful. So 1 year later, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, just as the Lord had said. She was 90 and Abraham was 100. So some takeaways that I believe we can learn from Sarah is, one, that she was faithful even though she doubted. And one of the first things you can see at the beginning of her story is that she was a woman of faith. And in Hebrews, she is referred to as a woman of faith. We can also see that she trusted the Lord and honored her husband, but she wasn't perfect. She made mistakes the same way we do. Though she experienced waves of doubt, she did turn back to her faith and trust in the Lord. This goes the same for us. When we're struggling with our doubt, with our faith, we know that we are to turn to the Lord, turn to the Word of God, instead of feeding into the lies and into the doubts. Now, I do believe that we can delay God's promises because we choose to be impatient, because we choose to lose faith. And I think this is just a great reminder. And some scriptures where we are reminded that we need to have faith is in 1 Corinthians 2:5, 2 Corinthians 5:7, Hebrews 11:6, and Romans 1:17. The other thing that we can learn from this story is that nothing is impossible for God. No matter how impossible it may seem, no matter how you feel, no matter if nothing seems to add up, we need to just have faith. And that faith can be as small as a mustard seed, as Jesus explains in Matthew 17:20. And just like Sarah's situation, conceiving at an age that was impossible, we do see a lot of situations where in the Bible, God has done the impossible, things that would not happen in the natural. God made happen because that's who He is. And He's the kind of God that likes to show off. And it kind of goes back to having that faith and trust in the Lord. I believe that Sarah's story is an encouragement for all of us. And the fact that God can do anything, that God can move any mountain if it's His will. And so Luke 1:37 is another scripture reminding us that nothing is impossible for God. The other thing that we can learn is patience. And I explained this before. I'm probably one of the least patient people, but I'm trying. I'm getting better. But for most of us, being patient isn't easy. And in the process, she did begin to doubt and lose her faith. But regardless, what God says He will do, He will do. And it's not always in the way that we expect it. Our ways are not God's ways, and God's ways are not our ways. And God's timing is perfect. His ways are perfect. And He does all things for our good according to His glory. And sometimes that waiting season is for us to be able to grow and to prepare us for whatever it is God has for us moving forward. And I believe that's why God only gave Abraham bits and pieces. He spoke to him several times, but He never gave him the whole picture. He didn't tell him until the fourth time how he was going to have a child. He promised him a child. He promised him, land, and that his offspring would, inherit the land. And He promised him all these things. But it wasn't till that time before the angels arrived that He had told him that you're going to have that child through Sarah. And so I believe that over time, God was trying to build his faith, build his trust in Him, prepare him. And sometimes that preparation season feels like forever, but we just have to trust that everything is in His timing. So I hope this video encouraged you guys. I hope that if you're really wanting to, that you'll dig into this story more, because there's so much more in these couple of chapters in Genesis. And there was just so much more I learned, and I tried to condense it as much as I could. Let me know in the comments below any scriptures that you tend to hold close to your heart during different seasons in your life. Is there a particular person in the Bible that you relate to? Let me know in the comments below who that is and why. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to check out the playlist below with all the other women sharing different women in the Bible that we can all learn something from. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.